Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And yeah, this is a little bit late. It's been a little insane to observe the past 48 hours and expect that you were going to get anything done, much less regularly scheduled album reviews and catch up from last year. But truthfully, I was planning for this to drop in 2020, or at the very least before my top albums of 2020. At least half that's now true. But alright, to close off album reviews for that last year, this is On the Pulse. So we got 7 albums on the docket. Let's first go back and talk about From Allie X, Cape God.
Fresh laundry.
So this album near the end of last year began stacking up the sort of praise you would think for a pop act would have exploded when Allie X dropped this in mid-February, so I'll admit I was kinda curious whether or not this would be the turning point from when I also covered her Stupid Late a couple years ago. And honestly, it's kind of tough for me to quantify why Allie X is still not really working for me, especially on an album where some have said this is chock full of bangers, and I'm struggling to hear them. Part of it is the feel that she's not a particularly dynamic singer, and going for a more formless and ethereal approach to the production and vocal mixing doesn't really help her stand out further. But honestly, a lot of the sound reminds me a lot more of the soft-focused indie pop acts that came out in the latter half of the 2010s, who were really trying to imitate Lorde's minimalism in a lot of her production, but without her intensity in her delivery or her writing chops. A lot of songs here, they default to some wistful musings where it seems like Allie X is chasing the impulses that might embody her muse, which is love, underweight introspection, a lot of moody whinging, drug abuse, rather than actually embodying them or experiencing them with any unique flavor or intensity. And you can clearly tell that Allie X is trying to lean into a vaguely gothic glamour vibe with a lot of her lyrical reference points and how often she's trying to sound sultry, but her production and delivery has not only none of that edge, but most of her sound is rooted in depressingly desaturated guitars and the occasional bit of washed out synth or reverb saturated arrange elements to support the bass thrums that make me wonder just how much the playbook was stolen from Billie Eilish, very early Charlie XCX, and even Troye Sivan, in which in the last case, given how often they've worked together on his albums, it makes way too much sense, especially on some of the groovier cuts. Now yeah, Rings a Bell and Susie Save Your Love, they got some nice bouncy vibes, as did that one anthem to blacken out hardcore Life of the Party. I mean, it doesn't make up for the awkward squonking of June Bloom, or how Super Duper Party People has such thoroughly embarrassing lyrics they squander the synth groove altogether, but overall, it's got its moments. It feels decently balanced in the grooves. I can see why people would consider this catchy, but there's just not a lot of distinctive color across the board, and it just winds up feeling kind of decent, but derivative. So it's a 6 out of 10. Give it a chance if you like the pop that I referenced, but do not be surprised if you've heard this done better before. That's all I'm saying. Next up from Corb Lund, Agricultural Tragic.
But she's never not had horses and she don't know what to do.
Oh, you thought we were done with some of the indie country. No. We're moving up with some of the big guns with Corb Lund, an Albertan singer-songwriter who's been active since the 90s and is a bit of an eclectic figure on the indie scene. A comparison that sprung to mind was a more offbeat and distinctly Canadian Dierks Bentley. And then he's a deceptively sharp writer, decent enough singer, and he's gonna go off on some wild tangents that you won't see coming and that will often find him at his very best. His album Horse Soldier probably remains his best for the innovative instrumental choices and its remarkably nuanced take on war, and his 2012 album Cabin Fever really handled a lot of its grit effectively, even if I've got a surprising soft spot for his 2019 project Losing Lately Gambler, mostly on the strength of some truly great writing. Now, I will say some of his experiments have faltered. I wasn't quite as impressed by his Dave Cobb team up on 2015's Things That Can't Be Undone, even if it actually is one of the very few Dave Cobb produced albums where the bass guitar sounded good. But you know what? It's been a long 5 years since we actually got original material from Corb Lund, and, well, this is an odd album to talk about, because it feels like it's trying to do two very different things at once. Now, on the one hand, it's a pretty straightforward, loose, honky-tonk indie country project that's playing with some very traditional song structures and Corb Lund's natural gift for humor. He's funny, and he's gonna make the most of it, with a lot of animal misadventure stories if that's your thing. But he's also very keenly self-aware, so the other angle is just how much he tries to celebrate the past and vintage country life in an era where a lot of those older stories, or dare I even say older people, might feel less relevant. And that can be a very tough balancing act for the best of country. I do appreciate that Lund is generally more thoughtful and good-humored, more focusing on his taste and not one to project on anyone else, and there is a very real sense of tragedy for someone who's older and trying to maintain her horse range, but they're just as old and creaky as she is. Or on a very sober note, how all the old western stories and myth-making, they can't fix a small-town meth addiction. I was reminded a fair bit of Ian Noe in both the detail-rich writing and the blend of past and present. Coulter Wall does this too, but Corb Lund has a much lighter touch, and the tone can get kind of wonky just balancing everything out. Now granted, the overall tone and texture of the album is so generally agreeable it's hard to complain. The bass groups are well balanced, the guitars are really bright with some nice interplay, and while I might struggle to find many standout tunes or melodies, it's often so uniformly solid it's hard for me to care. It's also a pretty quick listen, all things considered. You know, it's odd because I would say this is an ideal album for the country purist, but a distinctly Canadian flavor might throw some off, but hell, not me. Solid 7 out of 10, pretty enjoyable, check it out. Next up from yours truly, Self-Care. Alright, quick explanation here. I had a patron who joined a day or two after I had closed the schedule for the year, and they messaged asking about my thoughts on this. They said that this debut album was a shot of fresh air in pop punk, given how many interchangeable projects I had covered in 2020. And now, having heard it a couple of times, I really wish I was anywhere close to being as impressed as they were. For one, it's been a while since I've heard a groove and percussion section this utterly gutless. The bass has no texture, no defining punch, no bassist is actually credited in the liner notes, and I have questions about that. The drums, they feel inconsistent at best and painfully thin and sterile at worst. And as much as the frontwoman Michaela DeGaldo brings her best Hayley Williams presence to bear, if she's stuck with no real foundation to work with, she's gonna sound unsupported, and the mix is gonna sound like it's a half step removed from the increasingly sterile pop rock that flooded out to the mid to late 2000s. And without that foundation of groove and most of the melodies sticking to more traditional pop punk structures, it just felt increasingly forgettable for me. Not helped by the writing, which circles around struggles of confidence and composure in the face of breakups or relationship drama, where it's very clear that she's not over any of it, or the initial run of success that the band has actually had. There is one decent song about people finding a moment of odd solace at funerals that I thought was pretty alright, although it does feel like the less interesting version of similar themes that Slutface explored earlier this year. But otherwise, this really didn't stick with me whatsoever. Decent energy, but the production and underwhelming writing really held it back from just being interesting, so 5 out of 10, hit and miss, just does not stand out for me. Next up from Fleet Foxes, Sure. I said this back when I covered Crack Up 3 years ago. I always find myself a little bit startled how quickly Fleet Foxes seem to slip my mind. The sound is generally agreeable, it's well produced for this brand of indie folk rock, and while the content can be a messy conversation, I did hope that the band would stabilize a bit after Crack Up wound up as a bit of a myopic experiment. I mean, it's got its defenders, but by accident I think that my lukewarm reception of it wound up on the right side of history, which I did not expect or predict by any means. And thus it feels weird that when I've been going back to Shore as often as I have, while I think I like this a little more in terms of more defined and approachable compositions, I'm not nearly as moved by this as I want to be. A part of this is that you can clearly tell Fleet Foxes is treating this in a similar way to a back-to-basics project, or at the very least settling back into their comfort zone. The song structures are more approachable, they flow a little bit better, there's actually some decent grooves this time, and while I do think the project's momentum can feel kinda haphazard, especially by the final third, the sound is as warm and rich as it was on their first two albums. And you can tell some of that's intentional. Robin Pecknold may have had to jettison his entire band for recording and producing this, which unfortunately seems like it paid off in the unintentional foreshadowing of Crack Up, as he's now relying way more heavily on session musicians and guest collaborators. But you know what? He wanted to provide an oasis of comfort, a brighter moment for his audience, purposefully look outside of himself, and I'm not remotely convinced he pulled this off consistently. I referenced this when I reviewed the more conscious songs on Crack Up, and I really don't think I did the best of my possible jobs explaining my frustration there, but this album really crystallized it. It's the same problem. This is an album that somewhat wants to engage more directly in societal commentary, but it's got no real commitment in any degree of intensity or serious discomfort. I'm bringing back my 3 Ps for great political art, and where Pecknold falls glaringly short, it's in power and precision. He seems to grasp that his previous privileged observational approach didn't quite work, and he was right. And while he puts more lip service to wanting to move towards change or understanding the gravity of his situation, a lot of his language is still very much coaxed through his own circular musings and his own self-care and his own personal angst. And you know what? All of that can be valuable in the right context, and probably feels very relatable, especially to the very specific affluent hipster demo in 2020 that loves this album. But when neither the poetry or the delivery has much impact, and the production is as white bread and pastoral as ever, especially with all the horns, which feel way more big band than soulful, it's very easy to observe how much actual skin he has in this game, where I can't even say this feels all that populist. On Jara, he references the Chilean folk singer of the same name to try and call out everyone who fled New York City for their out-of-town estates during the pandemic, and it feels like he's trying to take the mantle of his impact without any hard references to Jara's actual leftist politics that got him killed by Pinochet. And that's kind of gross. Now granted, it doesn't surprise me from Pecknold, he ditched his entire band to get this out, which tells me a lot about that myopic focus. But it does mean that when he's more focusing on his own angst without explicit political allusion, like off the faster groove on Maestranza, or confronting his own depression on Can I Believe You, or even the self-aware piss take of Young Man's Game, the album's actually considerably more likable. But even there, in a song where he's trying to console a friend struggling with depression and addiction that's got a really good slow burn melody, it's still called I'm Not My Season. And the focus is nearly all internal, which effectively becomes the primary point of focus on the final third, which for as lush as all the arrangements feel, just rings really damn hollow for me, especially from where Pecknold said he was starting. Look, I don't know, I can't deny that when this album is just solidly introspective, Fleet Foxes, it does deliver, and if that's all it set out to be, that would have been fine, but when it tries to frame itself as more, especially early on, well, on Featherweight, Pecknold said he wanted to explore his sense of privilege a little bit more, wherein as in the execution, he just wound up revealing it. For me, strong 6 out of 10, but hey, all the critics liked it way more. Take that as you will. Next up, from Sa-Roc, the Sharecropper's daughter.
Be exactly who you are forever, 'cause they gon' try and change your heart. Don't let up, 'cause you're so damn fine.
So this is one of those cases where I've been very much aware of Sa-Roc, but I just haven't really had the chance to talk about her in recent years. In the first half of the 2010s, she was extremely prolific. A lot of forward-thinking and dense wordplay, pretty okay production, and a lot of charisma that contributed to a bunch of albums that occasionally ran very long, but on average were really damn solid. Paradoxically, when she actually trims her projects down, like on Babylon and Gift of the Magi, she just knocks them out of the park. There's some great stuff there. And then she signed to Rhymesayers, and we didn't hear a full project from her until 2020. Yeah, there's been scattered singles, but it adds to the unfortunate list of questions prompted about that label that I uncovered when I covered Psalm 1 earlier this year. Looks like indie rap labels' problems with women are not going away. Anyway, we did finally get an album that the Grapevine was telling me was really damn special, and here's the odd thing. This is a great album that does feature some consistently well-struck structured grooves, some really sharp bars, and Sa-Roc sounding sharper than ever. And yet, while it's an album I can return to easily, it's not one that truly grips me as much as I would want it to. And I'm not sure it's just any one thing that holds me back from embracing this as deeply as I would like. I thought at first it was Sa-Roc's flow that reminds me of a fusion of Kendrick Lamar and Eugen Blackrock in both cadence and delivery, with maybe a splash of Dessa in her singing. But again, these are all artists that I really like or outright love. That should not be a problem, especially as I would argue that Sa-Roc has an earthier, more soulful and distinctive tone than everyone I just listed, and that's generally something I really like. Now granted, this album isn't consistently in that territory. Some of the splashes of gauzy synth and the chipmunk vocals don't always blend as well as they could, and I get the feeling the album starts meandering on the back half and tries to end itself 2 or 3 times and doesn't really succeed. But I think my frustration with this album might actually run a bit deeper, because Sa-Roc is framing this project like a reintroduction, a reassertion of identity in the fact that she's a fantastic rapper claiming her voice, claiming her turf, and I just wish she went a little bit further. It kind of reminds me a lot of my problems with Elzai and wanting greater conceptual diversity in the songs. And while I understand here it's more justifiable given her absence and how her distinctive presence, she stands for more in rap, but it's also a through line that I've heard many times before, and it's odd when I can so clearly track a lot of her influences. The best moments come from when she's actually getting more personal and distinct in describing the past demons she has had to excise, be they history or old family vices or a music industry that never properly got on board with her more esoteric content. It's one reason that Forever is one of her best songs. But I also do have other niggling frustrations. She talks about wanting to elevate more black women to the art form, but the majority of her features here are men, all of whom deliver well, which coming out of 2020 though feels kind of odd, especially as she emphasized that she's not the typical rap chick who raps about sex. I mean, No Name proved you could do both, and while we're in this territory, black capitalism will never feel as revolutionary as it's framed, even if I do understand its importance to her and the culture. Again, just not for me. But while I'm on there, again, I like this a lot, and I absolutely recognize I'm not the target audience, but after the past solid 2 to 3 months of listens, I can call it great, but it doesn't quite resonate beyond that. So, light 8 out of 10, it's gonna get slept on by a lot of folks who will really enjoy it. I just wish I liked it more. Next up from Patricia Taxxon, Sapphire Apartment.
Nights and opal skies are here. The luster can hold our tears and handle our time.
Okay, look, she put it out on the last day of the year. She wanted me to talk about it. I don't even think she knows that I decided to slip it onto my schedule out of my own curiosity, especially as I missed covering Fresh Tapes 2. You want my quick impression of that? It once again proves that Taxxon is a sharper and more intricate and refined producer than most in hyperpop, and while that pays huge dividends with Backwash, she may have overthought the entire experiment as a whole, and it winds up kind of uneven, especially on the back half. But anyway, this album. She's been teasing this for a while as something that's trying for more of an accessible pop sound, and I only half agree with that assessment. It is more pop in the content, and balancing out between the party and hard love, heartbreak that yearns for more. In a funny way, it kind of reminds me of Tove Lo, and where the Fireflies cover makes way too much sense. But then you also consider a lot of the compositions or the album's structure, where it opens up with multiple instrumental cuts which pepper the album, and there's a song here that runs 7 minutes. It's not really mainstream pop. Now granted, I do think the album isn't quite as tight or hook-centric as it could be to fit within that genre, which in 2020 is very retro disco driven, or feels a little bit more rough around the edges to match with how Taxxon will very methodically construct her compositions, which fall into a similar vibe as Fresh Tapes 2, but a fair bit less abrasive. And this is something that I've been observing about her compositions for a while now, particularly in Mountain Pop. She's taken leaps in the composition that are rapidly outgrowing her instrumental palette and production. So when she's not making weird, unique, avant-garde electronic music or or sampling heavy for the Plunderphonics, you can start hearing the strain to reach a more organic, accessible sound and balancing out her own distinctive keyboard melodies with much sharper percussion. And that kind of worries me considerably for often as she's teased making a hip-hop album. Now, for the record, I like a lot of the live strings she brought onto this, and I really love some of the theatricality of both Emad Aladdin and Trevor Lake on their songs. They sound great. But on the other hand, she tried to put together a yearning trap pop R&B cut in You're Welcome, and the guest brought on for the cooing vocals, yeah, she's no Ariana Grande, especially for as frail as her upper register sounded. Gotta be real there. But outside of that, the shuddering bass of Boom made up for how much the horse felt like an over-arranged misfire when it came to the instrumental cuts. And overall, I do think this is pretty damn good, but it's an album that doesn't quite hit the pop magnetism that she was going for, nor the expansive yearning emotion or greater complexity in themes that's been her at her best. Ergo, for me, 7 out of 10, definitely a worthy entry, but take this with a grain of salt, she made better this year. And finally, from Playboi Carti, Whole Lotta Red.
When you feel like this, can't nobody tell you shit.
So let's be brutally honest here. Was it all worth the hype? Forget the obvious whole lot of mid jokes I saw the very night this dropped. To me, this just feels like the next coming of Eternal Take, where the meme about a sugary, overlong trap album, low on content but high on personality, set expectations way higher than they probably should have been. And as someone for whom Playboi Carti has always felt like more ad-libbing squeaky meme than credible MC, and who never really dug Die Lit 2 years ago, watching the backlash to all this was kind of fascinating, but alright, fine. How is it? Well, honestly, the majority of things I could say about Die Lit are just as true this time around, except this project is nowhere near as consistent, and you can tell that Playboi Carti was trying to evolve. Emphasis on trying. The first change is the production. It's rougher, it's more jagged, the synths buzz and spark against the once again overweight trap beats, with some of the most undercooked and faintly embarrassing attempts at gothic elements I've heard in recent memory. But let's be real, for as much as he wants to emphasize how punk or vamp this album is, it has shockingly little impact, especially when the tunes can feel so undercooked, and minus Pierre's consistent presence, the mixed quality's all over the damn place. But once again, even more questionable is Playboi Carti himself, who's trying to show more diversity beyond the husky, faux baby voice he was using, often trying to go for a harsher or lower register. And wow, he can't sell it at all with any power, which is painfully ironic given all the attempts at machismo that run rampant in the content, and say nothing of the homophobia. Again, I'll repeat myself when I cover Die Lit. He's got more texture than intensity in his voice. Only this time around it's worse because he's trying to convey intensity and edginess, and he's flailing with a lot of painfully sloppy flows. And when the album is 24 tracks and over an hour, the broad stretches of try-hard emptiness makes us feel even more hollow. I don't know, it's got the painful feel of somebody who clearly knows they are on their 15th minute. And while Kanye West, Kid Cudi, and Future at least sound a little bit more invested than Die Lit's guest stars, it can't escape the feel of a meme being stretched too far. I mean, I've seen a lot of rappers who are built for short-term bursts or are powered by the meme. They get through on one overpraised album, then they fall off a cliff. Looks like it's happening again. I mean, I said it on Billboard Breakdown, at least the song with Kid Cudi is legit good. And I was surprised how well the soulful touches worked on the closer, so very light 4 out of 10. And man, I feel like I'm being generous. Just saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. So my plan is to get my best albums of 2020 out in the next couple of days. I'm working flat out on it. Stay tuned for that. I also have a special message surrounding the future of this channel for 2021, how I'm structuring album reviews and On the Pulse. So please stick around for that too. It's actually going to be pretty interesting. I got some fun plans opening up for that. Beyond that though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process for 2021, or potentially be on my Discord server, link to my Patreon is right over there. Again, in stressful times, please do not feel obligated to. I will be just fine. It's only an option. But the option's available. Please be welcome to check it out if you want to. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.